Hi there, folks. In this video, we're going to go over how macromolecules, the things that living things are made of, starches, fibers, proteins, are used to build plant cells. And the reason we're doing this is I think a lot of you have memorized what a starch is and memorized what a protein is. But I want you to see where they would actually be in a cell, and maybe that helps you put some of this stuff together and remember it a little bit more functionally. So what I'm drawing in here are all the different major parts of a plant cell that are worth noting. There is a big old storage area of water. This is this thing called a vacuole found on the left there. We're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on all these structures sort of on the right side of this cell. And one by one, I'm going to tell you what they are, what they're made of, and why we should care. So we're going to start with the cell wall, which is sort of on the outside of most plant cells, and that just kind of gives it structure. This is just what makes, plant bark and plant trunks and stems have some structure. They've got some rigidity to them, and helps them, withstand stresses. Inside of that, all these gray lines and even some of the other lines are membranes. These are just the barriers, the things that keep one thing apart from another. Just like our cells have to separate blood from other things in our bodies, we always have these little barriers, and those are called membranes. Now, in a lot of plant cells, in say roots or tubers or in nuts, you're going to find starch granules and oil bodies. This is just your way of storing starch, as sugar basically, in long-term storage, or storing it in a sort of denser form in the form of a fat or an oil. Towards the bottom, we've got a nucleus, and hopefully you remember that's where you have your genetic information. That's where the chromosomes are. And then we have all these other organelles, which are, your mitochondria and your chloroplasts and a number of other organelles, which we're not going to get into. Okay, so the purpose of this video is to remind you what each of these things is made of and how that relates to, the sugar that these plants are making using photosynthesis. So first of all, the cell wall is primarily made up of fibers, and this includes something you may have heard of called cellulose, but very simply, it's just a bunch of sugar molecules put together in a chain. In more technical terms, it's a polymer of glucose, but it's just a chain of sugar molecules. Now, I think you all know this. If you chewed on wood pulp, it wouldn't be sweet. But that's because this is a different thing and you can't break it down in your digestive system. If you eat any paper or something, it goes in one end, out the other. That's in comparison to what starch is. And this is a way of storing sugar in a way that can be digested. So when a plant makes fiber, it's there for good. That's the idea, at least. If a plant makes starch, it's just putting the sugar into storage so that it can use it later. When we eat starch, we just break it into sugar and use the sugar. So you can see both of these here. They're just sugar molecules put together in a chain. Now that's in comparison to the next two, which are going to be lipids. Membranes are made in large part out of phospholipids, and the oil bodies are, fats, oils. And these are going to be made up of different constituents. So the important thing to keep in mind here is, hopefully you remember, glucose and other sugars are made exclusively of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, CH and O. And that's going to be the same for other carbohydrates that you've got on this diagram. Fibers and starches, for the most part, just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So easy enough, with all of that extra sugar that plants are making in their leaves, they can make pretty much unlimited fiber and starch as long as they have access to sunlight. All right, they've got plenty of sugar. Phospholipids are a little bit trickier. Fats and oils are actually really similar to the fibers and starches in that you can make them just out of sugar. Now, they don't have as much oxygen in them, but they can be made quite easily. For a plant, making a phospholipid is a little bit trickier because in addition to the CH and O, they also need a tiny bit of phosphorus in the form of a phosphate group and nitrogen in the form of an ammonia or a nitrate group. Now, these have to be absorbed from the soil, hopefully. Now, so far, we've been able to produce most of the parts of the cell using just what's in sugar, just the CH and O in glucose. The stuff towards the bottom of this diagram is where things get a little bit tricky for most plants. To make the proteins, which are what most organelles are built of, so all these organelles, the mitochondria and the chloroplasts and whatever else is in a plant cell, these have membranes, which are phospholipids, but the machinery inside them, all the machinery inside them is primarily going to be proteins. In the nucleus, you've got the chromosomes, which have DNA and protein. You've got a lot of machinery in the form of proteins. All of these are going to be more difficult for a plant to produce because in addition to the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that we can get from sugars if you're a plant cell, they all need significant amounts of nitrogen, way more than would be needed to put in a phospholipid. Proteins also tend to require a little bit of sulfur, though it's not a huge deal. And DNA and RNA definitely need significant amounts of phosphorus in the form of a phosphate group. So, as you can see, when a plant is doing photosynthesis, hopefully you remember, they're taking in CO2 and water from the outside world and producing a huge amount of glucose, C6H12O6. That the C's, H's, and O's in the glucose can be used and remodeled in a different way to build starches and fibers, to build fats and oils pretty quickly. To make a phospholipid, you're going to have to take those same atoms and add a little bit of phosphorus and nitrogen to them. And then to make the proteins, the DNA and the RNA, that's where the plant really needs to be able to soak up from the soil significant amounts of nitrogen and some phosphate too. These tend to be the reasons that plants have difficulty. If a plant is getting watered and is getting sunlight and it still isn't thriving, it's probably because it doesn't have enough nitrogen or phosphate or sulfate or iron or some other micronutrient. One of those things is missing from the soil it's growing in. Typically, we can do this agriculturally through crop rotation and planting legume plants, which we've talked about in class, or what is commonly done is adding artificially generated fertilizers to the soil. We'll come back to that in another unit. Hopefully this gave you an overview of what the different macromolecules are used for in plant cells and which can be easily and which can be more challengingly produced in plants. Thanks. See you next time.